point that we now have a bubble time bomb of an economic system in the West. I mean, the banking system that we once had that used to invest in building infrastructure, that used to, invest in creating things and applying new technologies to improving the conditions of life of people. That used to, before I was born and before many of us here in the audience even were born, I think, that used to be the way I've read our society was wired, especially after World War II, where you had 25 years of prosperity, emerging out of the war. Most of the infrastructure here in Canada, where I live, was built during that 1945 to 1970 something period. And then something happened in the early 70s when a bit of a sleight of hand was induced. And there was a transformation that I think a very key moment is this period of 1971, when there was something that occurred in the United States. For those who don't know, this was a period where Bobby Kennedy had just been assassinated. Martin Luther King had been assassinated. John F. Kennedy, Malcolm X earlier had been killed. In Europe, you had leaders like Enrico Mattei, the great industrialist who had a great vision for the development of Africa and the breaking of colonialism. He was killed in something associated with Operation Gladio, which was a NATO CIA utilization of stay-behinds from Italy and from Germany that continued to carry out fascist operations, including terrorist operations and cells of terrorists and cells within cells that ran all over Europe, including into Canada, carrying out things that killed civilians, but as well a lot of targeted statesmen, people like Dag Hammarskjöld, the UN Secretary General, whose plane had also been sabotaged, just as Enrico Mattei's. There had been many others. The ouster of de Gaulle had occurred in 1969. And so coming out of the wake of the elimination of many of these statesmen who had been trying to induce and defend a certain type of economic order founded upon industrial progress, the development of the powers of labor of not just their own countries in France or Germany or Italy or the United States, but rather extend the right for every nation, including nations of Europe, of Africa, of South America, of India, of Asia, to also access those technologies and those industrial abilities to stand on their own 2 feet with full spectrum economies. That was all crushed. And with them out of the way, you had what was done in 1971 with the separation of the dollar.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
The US dollar, which was the basis of international exchange, right? Everybody had to own US dollars to have any form of balance of payments satisfied in any form of exchange since 1944 or 45. So after that, there was a cutting off of the US dollar from the fixed exchange rate system, which was a system that had been set into motion as part of the Bretton Woods, which ensured that speculation on local currencies could not happen. You had a relative fixing of everything relative to the price of gold at around $35 an ounce. And that allowed for a certain ability to think long-term, because if you're not allowing speculators to gamble on the prices of currencies, you have a creation of an environment of stability, right? So if you're a businessman, you can think now 5-10 years in the future about the relative parity of prices, and you could build large-scale infrastructure. That takes time before it garners feedback, a payback, right? If you're going to build something really big, it takes a lot of patience before it's going to start giving you return on investment. After 1971, when the dollar was floated to the floating exchange rate, and then within 2 years to the petrodollar, to the price of oil from the OPEC countries, meaning that what Kissinger ensured in both cases was that any sale of oil, whether on the spot markets, on the futures markets, had to be settled in US dollars. So that basically created a condition where speculative activity became the determinant of what gave the dollar value. And at that moment, there was a myopia had set in. And instead of thinking about large-scale real investments, the real economy, is your money playing a role in benefiting people's lives, benefiting your nation, that was severed. That standard was broken. And we increasingly became focused on generating at maximum returns on profit within the next maximum 2-3 quarters. There's been an adage in business that somehow came about, I've been told by many people, that unless you can prove that an investment can garner payback within 3 years, it's not worth doing. I can tell you that's a really bad way of doing business if you're thinking about 8 billion lives on the earth. So with that new logic, a consumer society cult was set in. The US started outsourcing its industries, its manufacturing. So did Canada. So did a lot of Europe, to cheap labor markets. We know what happened. The logic was, well, we can pay Mexicans, or we could pay people in Asia a very low wage, $1 an hour or less, to do the work we used to do, for higher pay and for better quality work. We can scrap that and instead use cheap labor, sweatshops, and ensure more profit. We're going to not produce the things we used to. And as a consequence, the West lost their economic sovereignty. We lost the ability to produce for ourselves, and we became dependent upon keeping nations poor, because the second now all of a sudden these nations started, if they were to ever really develop themselves and have a higher standard of life and better quality of education, better quality of infrastructure, their labor would become more expensive, which would then break the formula. So we had to now justify keeping these different nations in the dirt. So with that came this idea of deregulation, right? With the deregulated system, nations no longer were told protectionism is the old wisdom, right? The idea that you could have a dirigist economy with protection to protect your local manufacturers or farmers, that's the old wisdom. The new wisdom is everything goes. We deregulated the banks to allow for mergers and acquisitions. We saw what happened in the late 70s throughout the 80s with the creation of these corporations that had increasingly more clout than sovereign governments.
Estamos frente a un verdadero conflicto frontal sobre las grandes corporaciones transnacionales y los estados. Estos aparecen interferidos en sus decisiones fundamentales, políticas, económicas y militares por organizaciones globales que no dependen de ningún estado y que en la suma de sus actividades no responden ni están fiscalizadas por ningún parlamento, por ninguna institución representativa del interés colectivo.
And universal banking set in, starting with things like the Big Bang in England under Margaret Thatcher, right? Which was this idea that we will create universal banking. No longer are we going to keep our banking activities separated between investment versus commercial banks or insurance or trusts that all have to be kept under separate roofs. No. It's going to be more efficient if we just let everything merge into these big multi-headed Hydra beasts where you could do one-stop shop banking in one shot. And with that, speculators began to, for the first time since 1933, have access to savings, to commercial banks. So deposits that were supposed to be assigned purely for the real economy became now put increasingly into speculative activity. Things like Alan Greenspan's normalization of derivatives, what he called creative financial instruments, which was something that was done in 1987 to solve the Black Tuesday of October. I think it was October 25th, 1987, when the whole economy nearly went into another Great Depression, right? The stock markets lost 25% of their value in one day. And everyone was worried we were going into another 1929 depression. So, and we were, except unlike 1929, Alan Greenspan, who was there at the helm this time at the Federal Reserve, said, okay, the solution is we are going to take these things you used to get thrown into jail doing, junk bond sales, right? Things that Michael Milken had gotten, a scam artist, had gotten put into prison for. And we're going to now make this a normal part of the economy. So you can not only just take junk bonds, and there's a whole variety of bad debts, and you can now put insurance on them and gamble on the price of the value of the insurance, either next week, next month, next year. We'll give them a variety of names. And these derivatives went from, I think, a total, last time I checked, in 1991 of about $2 trillion in 1991 was the total valuation of derivatives. That process took on a life of its own, or a death of its own, if you want to think of it that way. And by 1999, when Bill Clinton destroyed Glass-Steagall, grown to about $78 trillion very quickly. That had outpaced the world GDP. Just to get this rate of growth of this cancerous tumor in place that took over the economy, by 2007, when the housing market blew out in the USA, with also ramifications across Europe and beyond, this had grown to $750 trillion, this derivative bubble. That was well over 10 times the world GDP by that time. That was what was even registered. That was a low estimate. I've seen economists who have said, if you take all of the variables into consideration, including a lot of what goes on in the British Cayman Islands, a lot of the stuff is covered up. It's probably today well over 1.2 to 1.5 quadrillion dollars, about 20 times the world GDP. This is the bubble that was not resolved in 2008, when we did have a chance to restore Glass-Steagall.